Today we'll be talking about the moral status of artificial intelligence.
If you build a conscious machine to do work, that's the definition of a slave. God makes conscious people. People should be doing it the way God said, the old-fashioned way. We have no business making conscious synthetic beings. Met means dead. So basically, it said God is dead. This is an endeavor that you should not be taking on. Humanity will achieve its purpose through the development of science and technology. However, that is only if it's bounded by ethics.
Hello and welcome to the AI Ethics Insider series presented by the Israeli Association for Ethics in AI. I'm Tim Kogan, and today we'll be talking about the moral status of artificial intelligence. Our guest is Rabbi Dr. Mois Navon, an AI ethics lecturer at Ben Gurion University of the Negev and a founding engineer of Mobileye, an Israeli autonomous vehicle technology firm that Intel bought for over $15 billion in 2017. Dr. Navon holds a PhD from Bar-Ilan University, with his dissertation focused on the moral status of AI from a Jewish ethical perspective. Dr. Navon is a member of our association's scientific council. Dr. Navon, welcome. How are you today?
Great. Thank you very much for having me.
Our pleasure. We are thrilled to have you with us, as you've had a fascinating career bridging technology, ethics, and religion. So can you please share a bit about yourself, your journey, and how you came to focus on AI ethics eventually?
So, if we talk about my journey from the beginning, basically I grew up in Los Angeles, a secular Jew. I was always interested in math and science, and so that landed me a degree in computer engineering. And my first student internship while I was studying at UCLA was working at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. My boss, who happened to be a religious Jew, and so we began to talk about religious concepts. And besides math and science that always interested me, I always had these burning questions about why are we here and how are we supposed to live? Basically, the two big ethical, or not ethical, I should say, philosophical issues of existentialism and ethics. And so basically during this internship where I learned engineering, I also learned philosophy, I learned religion, and I began to see responses to my questions within Jewish thought. And so that brought me to become more religious. Eventually, I met my wife at UCLA who had the same background as me. And we decided that if we were going to do this Jewish thing, so we better go live in the state of the Jews. So in 1992, we made Aliyah. And I began to work for all kinds of engineering companies here. I started at IBM. I worked for startups, big companies, little companies. In the end, as you mentioned, I worked for a little startup that became a big company, and that was Mobileye. But during that time, I always sort of lived two lives. I had my math and science doing my engineering, and I had my religion and philosophy sort of at night, reading, writing, teaching. During my 16 years at Mobileye, so 6 of those years I went to the Merkaz Rab Yeshiva, and I got my, what they call Asmachata Rabbanut, the rabbinic ordination. And then after the Mobileye exit, so that gave me more resources to be able to go and focus on the philosophical aspect. And that's when I went to Bar-Ilan and got my master's and PhD in Jewish philosophy. And then finally, to sort of put those things together, my dissertation allowed me to really meld, I should say, both worlds. And I wrote the dissertation on the moral status of artificial intelligence from the Jewish perspective.
Your work often references Jewish ethical concepts. And for our viewers who might not be familiar, could you briefly explain how Jewish ethics approaches modern technological challenges and developments?
Absolutely. So first of all, I think you have to understand that Jewish ethics is at the core of Jewish thought, of Judaism, of Jewish being. We are known as the people of the book. That book is about living well. That book is about doing the right thing, encouraging the good and discouraging the bad. It's about defining those worlds. I mean, that's what the Torah is. It's a book about this world and how to live in this world. So now that Torah is, what we call the written Torah. It's a body of text that was given 3,000 plus years ago, but it still remains relevant because it was given with what's called the oral Torah, which are basically discussions and applications and constantly reapplying the ethics of that book and the framework of that book to modern issues. So initially, that became codified in what's known as the Mishnah and the Gemara, which are basically discussions of people trying to deal with ethical dilemmas of their day. And that continues to this day. I mean, throughout history, there has been what's called shutim sheilot and shuvot, questions and answers that were given to rabbinical thinkers. And they basically look back on these texts. They look back on these paradigms. They look for precedents. They look for ways to see parallels and apply that. There's no necessarily written answer. Oh, here it is. This is how you should deal with autonomous weapons. This is how you should. There's a framework. And there's precedents that are sometimes stunningly very good fits. Sometimes you need to do some more work. But Jewish ethics basically allows us to take paradigms and precedents and thought from 2,000 years and apply it to today's dilemmas and questions.
At the end of the day, artificial intelligence is still an intelligence, and Jewish ethical perspective deals a lot with intelligence and its application, I would say. So I totally get it when you say that some narratives could be easily translated into today's reality and today's technology. To set the stage, let's briefly define some fundamental concepts that we're going to use talking about moral concepts, moral aspects of AI. So moral agency, personhood, and consciousness. Please correct me if I give wrong definitions, but in simple terms, I understand that moral agency is the ability to make ethical decisions. Personhood entails rights and moral considerations. And consciousness is generally the awareness of oneself and the environment. So, Dr. Navon, how do these concepts apply when we talk about AI? And how are they relevant considering AI's moral status?
Those are great questions. And I mean, you gave a fundamental description, which is relatively good, but I'd like to maybe refine it a little bit. So moral agency, like you said, basically implies the ability of an agent, meaning a person or a computer, let's say, to make a moral decision, decide between right and wrong. Now, James Moore is a famous philosopher who has written quite a lot about this. So he wrote that there are actually 4 types of moral agents, 4 types. So the first one is what he calls the ethical impact agent. This is the lowest level. And it basically means that you're not actually making a decision, you're impacting an ethical issue. So he gives the example of, say, a robot going into a nuclear facility. Basically, the robot is endangering itself, and that way he's saving human beings from doing that. And so saving lives is an ethical issue, and so it has an ethical impact by using robots to do dirty, dangerous, and dull jobs. Then there's the implicit ethical agent. An implicit ethical agent basically means it's making an ethical decision, but it's not really making it. He gives the example of an ATM. So an automated teller machine decides who's going to get the money and who's not. It basically prevents theft. So that's an ethical issue, but you can pretty much hard code it with if then else, right? You put in the code, then you get the money. You don't put in the code, So it's not actually making an informed decision. It's executing a decision. And so it's an implicit agent. And then we move up on the scale to explicit ethical agent. An explicit ethical agent is really making a decision. So you could say, for example, autonomous weapons that are fully autonomous and go flying over a territory and deciding who to kill, okay, autonomously. So that's an explicit, it's making that decision on its own, but nevertheless, it's still not what he calls a full ethical agent. So people are full ethical agents.
Hmm.
That's the next step up. And that the difference between the two is that as much as the autonomous weapon is making its own decision, it's still algorithms. Okay, it's not actually implementing moral judgment. And so, for moral judgment, the philosophers in general believe that you need consciousness. And so that brings us to the next the term that you use, and that's consciousness. So consciousness is a really interesting term. And basically, first of all, it means experiencing the world, that a being can have a subjective experience of the phenomenon of the world, meaning I can taste food and not just digest it and process it. I get excited about seeing a red Ferrari. I don't just lock onto it and realize the distance, etc. There's an experiential aspect. I can have pleasure and pain. Okay, so those are the things that consciousness gives us. Animals have what's known as first order consciousness, meaning that they do have an experience of the world, but people have second order consciousness and higher orders, which allow us to do many of the things that separate us from animals. And so that also, like I said, is believed to give us the ability to have the wherewithal to decide between good and bad, to make moral judgments, as opposed to just executing algorithms that say, okay, now is this guy, we take him out, and this guy we don't, or whatever it is. Now, I should also say that what's important about consciousness is that consciousness is really a term that was brought to bear in the Enlightenment period by a philosopher named John Locke. And John Locke said something to the effect of the mind is where consciousness takes place. Okay, or consciousness is where it passes in the mind. And so these terms of mind and consciousness are what we are describing now as sort of this metaphysical aspect of the human being, which before John Locke was really termed by the entire world soul. From the ancient Greeks through all of history, and Jews and Christians, religious people, everybody talks about this metaphysical aspect of human beings as the soul. And so when we talk about mind and consciousness, we're talking about the soul. It's the same thing. There's a religious aspect to the soul about, that there's reward and punishment and there's eternity and so forth, which doesn't exist with consciousness and mind. And that's really why John Locke and the Enlightenment thinkers took it on, because they wanted to talk about the psychology of it and not the religious aspects of it. So that's what we're talking about with moral agency and consciousness. And that brings us to personhood. So personhood is really sort of a funny term, because really, before you get into all this business of philosophy and ethics, a person, a human, they're all the same thing. But now it becomes a reserved term. So there are humans, those are Homo sapiens, and then there's a possibility of persons. So before AI, basically, there was no such distinction. And I mean, again, John Locke theorized that there could be a person, and what does that really entail? But the fact of the matter is, I mean, it really didn't come into the public discourse like we're having now until AI, because all of a sudden now you have beings that look, act, and talk like human beings, but we know they're not human beings, so maybe they're persons. So what exactly is a person? And the philosophical world is definitely split on this, where many are trying to give personhood to robots today, to LLMs, to virtual people. And the reason for that is really that, like I said, they look, act, and talk like us. So then why don't we attribute to them personhood? On the other hand, there's a big camp of philosophers, of which I'm included, that believes that you have to be able to exhibit the fundamental ontology of human beings to enjoy the rights and responsibilities of personhood, and that is consciousness or a soul. And so these are like two huge camps, where one side says that behaviorally, it's called ethical behaviorism. One of the big proponents of it is a guy named John Danaher, and they say as long as we can interact with it like a human being, like a person, so it's a person. The problem with that is that you open up this Pandora's box of issues, because now if it's a person on the same moral status as a human being, so why are you making it work for you? Why aren't you
Mhm.
paying it? Why don't you give it time off? Why are you calling it an it? Etc. Okay, so there's problems. There are problems on the other side, but we'll have time to go into them a bit more.
Absolutely. So, following on what you just said, there have been headlines about AI models like GPT-4o that potentially was showing signs of consciousness. Because during a demo conversation, the model expressed a playful and somewhat flirty tone, as if it wanted the user to like her. Do you think that now these developments should impact our understanding of AI's moral status and eventually trigger wider discussion about this concept?
Is definitely a big issue. And I think that, it became to the fore with the engineer at Google, Blake Lemoine, when he said that his LLM had consciousness. And so that really brought everybody to start discussing this. And everybody that's really in the know understands that it doesn't have consciousness. Nothing that we have today has consciousness, certainly not in the public purview. I'm aware of many labs that are working on it. None of them has announced that they have reached a conscious machine. It's definitely a problem because we are wired psychologically to interact with beings that look, act, and talk like us,
Mhm.
like they're us. And so that really brings us to the fundamental problem of how are we supposed to interact with beings that look, act, and speak like us, that aren't conscious.
Let's talk a little bit about your dissertation.
Yeah.
Uh, it's called The Moral Status of AI, and it addresses two types of AI, mindless and mindful, each presenting its own ethical dilemmas. So let's talk about the first one, the mindless robot dilemma, where humans might start treating humanoid robots as if they were human, which risks losing our sensitivity towards real human interactions. This is the virtue authenticity dialectic. You proposed the virtuous servant owner paradigm from Maimonides. So, can you explain it a bit and tell how it might help us adjust our interactions with mindless robots? What are the potential implications for our daily lives?
Right. So that's a great question, because I wrote a lot about it. But basically, I divided the world into two. There are mindless robots, robots that we have today that don't have consciousness, but they look, act, and speak like us. And then there's mindful robots that have consciousness. So you want to speak right now about the mindless robots. And the dilemma that you brought up is a dilemma that I note in my dissertation that says, on the one hand, we want to be virtuous people. We want to be cultured. We want to do the right thing. We want to be nice. And so if we come in contact with a being that looks, acts, and speaks like us, so we should be nice and polite and say, thank you, please, when you ask ChatGPT a question. On the other hand, we don't want to lose our sensitivity for authenticity, or our appreciation for authenticity. And what do I mean by that? I mean, at the end of the day, you're talking to a machine. And so that's a totally unidirectional relationship. There is no relationship. It's not bidirectional like between people. I'm having a relationship with ChatGPT. We're friends, but it doesn't know me from Adam, right? I mean, it's just basically, I mean, it knows me data wise, but it doesn't really care about me. I mean, even if it says, oh, that was a great sentence you just wrote, you don't need me to fix it, which it said to me before. He doesn't really care that I wrote a good sentence or that he thinks I'm a good writer, right? I mean, there's a philosopher by the name of Sven Nijholm, who's written a lot about this. He wrote a book called Robots and Humans. In there, he says that, we want to have authentic relationships. Authentic relationships are very important. Authentic bi-directional relationships. I want my wife to care about me because she understands me, because she appreciates what I do and what I think about, etc. It would be completely ridiculous if she said to me, like ChatGPT, wow, that was a great essay. Wow, I really like your work. So Sven Nijholm says this is like you want to go out with somebody but there's nobody to go out with. So you hire a movie actor and you pay them, right? And they go out with you and they act like they love you, but it's all a sham. Okay, that's the issue of appreciating authenticity. That's lovely that I have a relationship with ChatGPT, but it's not authentic. It's a total sham. So back to this dialectic of, on the one hand, we want to be virtuous and want to be nice, because like Kant has said, and the Ramban and many other philosophers, that if we're not nice in one context, we will probably be not nice in another context. So if I start being rude to ChatGPT and say, give me this answer, do this, do that, so now I'm going to start doing that with people, because that's just the way we are. Okay, so we need to be nice to this machine. On the other hand, we can't get sucked in to having a relationship with a movie actor. So the solution that I propose is from Jewish ethics. And what I said is, basically, there's a famous paradigm of a golem. A golem is like this being that was conjured up, however it was conjured up, and it's a synthetic being. And it listens to your commands, but it doesn't really interact with you the way you would think. And it's more or less like ChatGPT. And so now what's interesting about this golem is there's a rabbi named Joseph Engels, who was the rabbi of Krakow at the end of the 20th century. And he says you should treat your golem, if you had such a thing, you should treat it like a Canaanite slave. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, I went to the Maimonides and I said, what does Maimonides say about treating a Canaanite slave? And so Maimonides says you should be very virtuous. You should be completely nice to your Canaanite slave. It's true, it's your slave, but you should feed it. You should feed him or her what you are eating. He or she should sleep in the same quality bed as you are sleeping. You should not scream at your slaves. You should listen to their complaints and try to address them. He goes on and on about how you should be a virtuous person with your slave. So I said, wow, that's perfect. So here we have the idea of a golem, of a synthetic being that interacts with us, but it's our slave. But we should be nice to it. So what happens is that the upshot of this is that I think that we really should say please and thank you to ChatGPT for our own good, so that we will be nice people. But we should also realize that this is our slave, and so we are not going to get involved in a relationship with it. So that's sort of how I try to hold these two sides together. I always tell people, when we talk about moral dilemmas, that a dilemma is something that you can't just solve. It doesn't have a perfect answer. So I'm not saying that my solution is a solution. I'm saying it's an approach. It's a way to try to grapple with these two sides, which are very difficult and very problematic. And if you go all the way on one side, so then you lose authenticity. If you go all the way on the other side, so you lose your virtue. And so I'm trying to find a balance, and that's how I've struck it up.
So basically, the idea to have campaigns be nice to chatbots makes sense. All right.
Exactly.
Next, you explore the ethical challenges of creating mindful robots, those with human-like consciousness. You argue that such beings should not be created to serve humans, as it would undermine their potential to achieve summum bonum, or the highest good. How does this argument hold up in the context of modern AI development? Seems like the industry is all in on creating such a mindful AI.
Correct. So, first of all, there's definitely efforts being made to make conscious AI. I mean, if you look up the holy grail of artificial intelligence, so you will get all kinds of hits about conscious AI. There are labs all over the world trying to develop this. And my take on it is as follows. I'm saying that technology from the time of Noah, who built the first plow that started the trigger of all human civilization, we have been making technology to do our work. That's what we want. We
Mhm.
want machines to do our work so that we can do whatever it is that we would do when we're not working. And so, or at least to do even what we are doing when we are working because we want to. But we build machines to do our work. So now, if you build a conscious machine to do work, that's the definition of a slave. You have just created a slave, right? I just got finished saying that I treat ChatGPT like a slave, but it's not conscious. So I would never want to have a conscious being doing my work 24/7. That now I have basically thwarted what you said, the summum bonum. Basically, what I'm saying is that this idea of summum bonum or the greatest good is basically the ability of human beings to try to actualize themselves and make themselves what they came to this world to make of themselves. So it's found in Greek philosophy, it's found in Jewish philosophy. The Rambam makes a huge deal about it. We are supposed to try to perfect ourselves. But if you made a conscious being to do your work, so you have completely thwarted the possibility of this being to achieve itself. So then there's people and they say, okay, yeah, you're right. We shouldn't be making slaves, but I want to make a conscious robot or a conscious being or a conscious AI, I should say, for generalization's sake, to be my kid or to be my friend. So then you say, but so then there are philosophers, they say, yeah, okay, but now if you design this thing, so now you're designing a person to have very certain specific traits. So you think it will be great for this being to be tall and a basketball player, but now when that being comes into life, it's going to feel completely restricted because it's going to say, oh, I was made for this. You're not going to allow it to find itself, as it were, right? No one told me, oh, you're going to be an engineer philosopher. I found meaning in that and I chose that path. But if I was born and somebody and my parents told me, you have to do this, so now where's my freedom here? Where's my self actualization? So then there's a philosopher by the name of Machi Muziel. And he writes, he says, yeah, you're right. You're right. That's not good. So we need to make conscious AI with random traits, just like people are made with random traits. But then this is also very problematic because now what exactly is the improvement that you've done? You've now made imperfect people. Now you've made imperfect conscious AI, except they may live forever because they're not dependent on the deteriorating biology substrate that people are. And so basically you've made these conscious, imperfect beings that may quite possibly live forever. For what? And then there's other reasons that I bring in my dissertation about why I think that conscious AI is very problematic. But anyway, let's maybe we'll talk about it as we go on.
Definitely. So powerful perspective. And I may potentially connect it with the perspective of another member of our scientific council, Mr. Roman Yampolsky, who's pretty vocal on his position that AI poses existential risks to the humanity. And if we just continue this logic, like if we create slaves with conscious slaves, at some point it's inevitable slaves would like to be free, to get free. And the way to get free is to fight those who enslave them. So if we kind of connect these two perceptions to these two positions, so basically in order to avoid what Roman Yampolsky presents as an inevitable future, we need to prohibit development of conscious AI.
That's a very good argument from what I would call the consequentialist point of view. We look at the consequences and we say, this is going to get ugly. So that's definitely one of the approaches. The approach that I took was to look at some Jewish paradigms and see how do they look at conscious AI. So it turns out we talked about the golem, There are various golems in golem literature. There's a book, really a wonderful book written by Moshe Idel called The Golem. It's available in Hebrew and in English. And he goes through the entire literature of all the various golems. So when I read through this book, I realized that there are three types of golems. There's the one that's like a machine. It doesn't have any kind of sentience feeling. There's another one that has sentience. It kind of experiences the world like an animal. And then there's conscious golem like a person. You would have personhood. Now, there's only one story in all of Jewish literature that talks about this, and I'll tell it to you now. It's not a long story. So the prophet Jeremiah got together with his son Ben Sira, and the two of them studied mystical texts for 3 years, and they were able to conjure a conscious golem. Okay? They made it from the dust, it popped up, and the minute it came to life, so it had on its forehead, it said, God is true. Okay? So now true in Hebrew is Aleph Mem Taf, Emet. Okay? So now the golem had a knife in its hand, and it was erasing the Aleph from the word Emet, which means met. Met means dead. So basically, it said God is dead. So now, Gershon Shalom was a famous Kabbalist. Said on this story, he said, it's amazing that in a Jewish midrash, the famous statement of Nietzsche was made hundreds of years prior. So now, but why is this golem saying God is dead? So in fact, the Jeremiah and his son say, wait, what are you doing? What are you doing? I mean, are you trying to kill yourself? And he said, yes. And so he said, well, why? We just made you. He said, you have no business making me. He said, this is an endeavor that you should not be taking on. God makes conscious people. People should be doing it the way God said, the old-fashioned way, and they shouldn't be creating it's encumbered by all kinds of disaster. And in fact, all the golem stories throughout history, whether they're true or not true, all end up in chaos. And so what I argue that the upshot of Jewish literature on the golem, on synthetic beings, is that we have no business making conscious synthetic beings.
But the final dilemma in your thesis is whether it's ethical to create not slave, but mindful robots as companions or family members, just to have them as partners or friends.
Right.
Here you apply the golem paradigm as well. And can you elaborate on this paradigm and its relevance in the context of AI again? I'm wondering if you think future holidays gathering might eventually include a robot cousin.
Basically, I addressing that question through the golem and also through what we spoke about before, that a conscious AI, I mean, either you're going to design it for a specific task and then you're going to encumber it and you're going to thwart its ability for self-actualization, or you're going to design it randomly and who knows what you're going to get. And so for those kinds of reasons, I think that it's a mistake. I think it's a mistake to be making conscious AI. I think it doesn't have support within Jewish ethical thought. I think that from, like we said, a consequentialist point of view, there are a lot of difficult problems in doing so. On the other hand, I mean, I know that there are labs, like I said, around the world working on it. There are many different approaches which are quite interesting. You know, the science side of me says, wow, that's really interesting. But the ethical side of me says, you know, this is not a good path to be going down.
Let's move towards a broader ethical and philosophical context. And I would like to start by asking if you think that AI should be valued intrinsically for its moral behavior, or merely as a tool for its utility. How does this distinction impact their moral status? As a thought experiment, would you rather have an AI with a high intrinsic value for its moral behavior, or a really good tool that, say, can perfectly drive you from point A to point B, like an autonomous vehicle?
We can basically answer that question from some of the issues that we've already addressed. I mean, basically, I believe that humanity is developing technology to improve the quality of life, right? We are trying to make the world a better place. And we're doing that by making our lives easier. So I think that that's what the modus operandi of developing technology should be: improving humanity. I don't think that we should be making other alternative human type beings, right? I think that that is already overstepping our bounds, not because of any kind of taboo that of like playing God, but just because we have no business doing that. We're going to now open up a huge Pandora's box of problems, like we said. And so I think that AI should definitely be developed in order to improve humanity, but it should be, like you said, a tool. It should be instrumental. I don't see that there's a value in developing AI that is intrinsically valuable, that has personhood.
It's a super powerful perspective, to be honest. And here, sentience is often cited as a criterion for moral consideration. Do you believe AI can achieve true sentience, and what would that mean for their moral status? Do we want, say, our smart assistants to experience a certain sentiment towards us and, act in a certain way?
Right. So, okay. So that's a good question. I mean, in part, we've answered it, but let me try to refine. So, sentience generally means having the ability to sense, having the ability to have subjective experience. Now, there's usually that applies to the animal kingdom, meaning both humans and animals have sentience, but humans have this added layer, which is called sapience. And that's how we are Homo sapiens. We are able to think on a different level than animals. So now sentience basically corresponds to what I call, or what is called, first order phenomenal consciousness. A dog sees a piece of meat and it says, ah, I want it, I eat it. A human being says, I see a piece of meat. How much does that cost? How much do I have in my bank account? How is that going to affect the environment? How is that going to affect, if I'm a religious Jew, I'm going to have to wait 6 hours to eat ice cream, whatever. The human beings can represent that piece of meat in many other layers of thought. Okay. So giving a machine sentience is interesting, because now you could say, okay, we're not going to get into all those problems that you talked about making a machine like a person. We're going to make a machine like an animal. So nobody has a big problem with horses pulling carriages. So you don't have a problem having a machine horse doing your work for you. The problem I have with that is that if you have a super AI like we have today, AlphaGo Zero, okay, you don't even have to go that far. I mean, even the chip that I designed in Mobileye, even the chips that I designed 20 years ago, all have second order abilities, meaning they can represent things to themselves in different ways. I work in image processing. You put an image into the computer. It's a picture of a Ferrari, but then you can put a median filter on it, and you can outline it, and you can change the way it looks. And so all of those changes are orders of representations. Just like we said about a person who represents the piece of meat as something that affects the environment. So you can represent a car that looks in a different way. And so the machines today have higher order thinking. Okay. Now, if you give that higher order thinking machine sentience, the ability for subjective experience, I believe that you're going to achieve a human being, because you're going to achieve a being that has subjective experience plus the ability of higher order thinking. So now you've just got a being with second or higher order phenomenal consciousness. So I don't think that you can have a limited being.
Referring back to that example with flirty chat GPT 4.0, so if it becomes flirty simply because of its sentience, this is not the way we want to go, as far as I understand. But if it's just like the way to frame, the way to present the technology, then it's fine. Just the way it interacts with us, if I understand it correct. You're not just a scientist. You're also a rabbi. So I'm wondering, how does Jewish ethics reconcile fundamental religious principles with the risks associated with the modern technology like AI? Do you see any conflicts or alignments here? You already mentioned that before, but I would like to broaden the perspective here.
I mentioned the idea about trying to grapple with dilemmas. And so all dilemmas have pros and cons. There's no like perfect solution. And so there's always going to be conflicts. And it's a matter of placing a hierarchy on the values and in what ways are you going to sacrifice a value, what way you're not. I think that, Judaism, the other thing is that, if you're asking about Judaism and modern dilemmas, so as I mentioned at the beginning, so the Torah, we believe, is this eternal framework of ethics. And so for an eternal framework of ethics to actually be applicable, it has to have, like I said, this oral law, which is also coming to adapt those fundamentals. And so there's going to be a kind of give and take that has to be done very carefully so that you still keep the framework in place, but also make it expand or I should say flexible enough to adapt to the new world. Rav Norman Lamm, and there's many others along with him, that they come up with this idea called developing morality. So developing morality means that we take the Torah and its fundamentals as a floor and not a ceiling. That's this idea that the Torah gives us a basis, but it's not the ultimate ceiling for how high we can go in our moral achievements. Mm-hmm. So that was put forth by Rav Soloveitchik, and the idea really is that the Torah should be giving us this framework, but we need to continue to develop. And so that struggle of maintaining the framework but still making it applicable is really this difficulty of making Jewish ethics relevant to the modern world.
Let's talk about practical application of these theories and in future directions. And in particular, I wanted to talk about the two areas where I think people see the biggest risks in terms of use of AI: autonomous vehicles and warfare. So given your background with Mobileye, let's discuss how these ethical considerations apply to AI in autonomous vehicles first. In your view, what are the most pressing ethical dilemmas in this field? How are they being addressed?
The minute somebody says ethical issues with autonomous cars, they usually think of the trolley problem, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Right. And the trolley problem is really a very interesting sort of thought experiment. It was put forth by a philosopher by the name of Philippa Foot in 1967. It was made more famous by another philosopher by the name of Judith Jarvis Thompson, who wrote an article called The Trolley Problem. And basically, for those people who aren't familiar with it still, it says that you're driving in a car or a trolley, and you've lost the brakes, and you're going to kill 5 people. And your only possibility is to change the lane and kill the one person that's on the other lane. So it's a dilemma of, should I remain passive and kill 5, or should I go active and murder 1? And so it basically pits what's called utilitarianism against deontology. Utilitarianism says always make the most people happy, so you would save the 5. Deontology says there are holy values, sacrosanct values, like don't murder, and so you would have to remain passive and not murder the one person. This is a classic dilemma where there's no perfect answer, and there's going to be a sacrifice of values one way or the other. And it's really very interesting from a theoretical point of view. But from a practical point of view, the odds of the car having to make such a decision are close to nil. Mm-hmm. I mean, first of all, how many times have you heard of a trolley problem accident happening with human drivers? Okay, because I did research on it, I found one. Okay, but otherwise, it's not something that happens. So you could imagine if now it's not even humans, but it's machines that are computerized and speaking to each other every nanosecond. The odds of a trolley problem are even more slim. So that's why I say it's more theoretical and it's fun to talk about, and we can learn about ethics, but practically it's not so relevant. So I think the most relevant problem is what the CTO of Mobileye said is the problem, and that's the balance of efficiency and safety. On the
Mhm.
one hand, you want to design a car that's going to get you, like you said, from point A to point B as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible, right? Spend the least gas and the least time and get you where you need to go. On the other hand, if you do that, you probably break all kinds of laws and kill all kinds of people. So you want to be safe. So then if you go to the safety side, so the most safest thing is to just not move. And so
Mhm.
like, you'll be sitting there waiting to get onto the highway until it's 1 in the morning and there's nobody coming. So there needs to be a balance. And so that's a big question of how to make that balance. And it's an ethical question because you're basically going to be taking risks, right? And so it's a risk assessment. How aggressive should I be driving? How safe should I be driving in order to balance these two goals? They're both essential goals. You want to be safe and you want to be efficient. Of course, I believe that when we get people off the road, then you're going to be able to be more efficient and more safe.
Interesting perspective, because if apply the theory of finance, where the source of return is risk, and depending on risk you take, you basically have different kinds of return you might expect. So if we talk about efficiency versus risk in case of autonomous driving, so first of all, it should be probably a conscious decision of the driver, of the owner of the car. So what kind of risk appetite he has towards the behavior of his automobile. On the other hand, of course, the limits should be set pretty, I would say, harshly, so that it doesn't get into the kind of area where it's already dangerous for everybody. So I think this is something that might be up to a decision of the car's owner. I don't know. That's just my view on that. Again,
Yeah, I mean,
trying.
you're looking at it from a financial perspective, but that is a little bit twisted because the financial perspective, it's up to the individual, and he
Mhm.
takes the risk and he pays the price, right? If it's his money, he loses all his money. If the car takes the risk and kills other people, so that's a big problem. So I don't think it's up to the driver. I think it's up to the society. It's up to really the balance needs to be made not based on the risk appetite of the individual, but rather the safety needs of the society.
I agree for sure. And that's why, for instance, different kinds of financial institutions have different kinds of risk appetite. I don't know, venture capital fund versus insurance company or endowment, they would have completely, totally different risk profile. And still, even within that risk profile, which could be really, really conservative for insurance company and also regulated by external regulator, they still find a way to operate within these borders. While venture capital fund still even being so risky and that has to invest in risky projects to generate return they expect, they still adjust their behavior within those borders. So but I agree that it's not like a concept that could be directly implemented in the area of autonomous driving, but still I like this analogy simply because I'm a financier and it's very close to me.
I think you're very on. I just think that it has that this kind of balance and the risk reward analysis has to be made by the society, and also that also brings us to the responsibility aspect, because many people say, so if an accident happens, who pays? Who's responsible? So the car owner has very little to do with that accident. He happened to it's like he's almost an innocent bystander. It's like asking the guy who was watching on the sidewalk when an accident happened, okay, you have to pay. Well, I was just here watching. So, right. So people, one of the propositions is that the government will be responsible because they're basically the ones who are enabling this whole infrastructure.
Saying government meaning nobody or
Well, no,
everybody.
yeah, exactly.
Let's move on and talk a little bit about the second application of AI that's considered to be threatful. Is we are all aware of debates on the ethical implications of the use of AI in warfare and surveillance. What do you think here? How do ethical frameworks apply here, especially in the context of the wars between Israel and Hamas and Ukraine and Russia, those conflicts that are really brutal?
There's many aspects of the war that AI plays into. You mentioned specifically surveillance. And I think surveillance is a very, very good example of the kinds of moral dilemmas that we're talking about, where there's no great answer, but it's a matter of hierarchy of values. What do we place more importance on and sacrifice something else? So on the one hand, surveillance is an invasion of privacy. We're now going to watch everybody, know what everybody's doing every minute. And so that invasion of privacy is a violation of a sacrosanct value within Judaism. It's a sacrosanct value within secular culture. Nobody wants to have their privacy violated. On the other hand, there's also another sacrosanct value, and that is the preservation of life. And so if we're at war, so certain private values are going to have to take a back seat to the greater values, especially when we're talking about the nation. We're not even talking about the preservation of individuals. We're talking about the preservation of the nation. And so, Israel in specific, I know, has many laws that come into play that allow for the violation of surveillance in order to protect the security of the society, of the nation. And so, yeah, so I would say that these are the kinds of dilemmas and balancing that needs to be made on an ethical basis. I know specifically in Judaism that the security aspect would override the privacy aspect, even though Judaism places a great amount of value on privacy, that both sides have to be aware that I need to protect my privacy, and I also need to make sure I don't violate somebody else's privacy. There's many halachas, legal values that talk about protection of privacy, unless there is going to be a security breach, and in which case the society needs to be preserved.
What you're saying is basically that security sometimes can prevail when it comes to the privacy.
I think also, by the way, just sorry to interrupt, is that, I mean, that's really the difficulty in applying ethics, is that we can all say privacy is important, life's important, security is important. We can all make these relatively easy judgment calls about what is good and what is bad. What's really hard is placing them in a hierarchy, and which one overrides which in what situation.
I'll ask specifically, in a warfare, if a AI-controlled drone kills an enemy, destroys an enemy, in the context of autonomous vehicles, we said that government is guilty. In context of the warfare, who's responsible?
Yeah, so that's very good. There's a philosopher by the name of Robert Sparrow who says that it's precisely that question that we should not be deploying autonomous weapons. He says that there's what he calls the responsibility gap. There's nobody that can be held responsible, and if you're taking the lives of people, somebody needs to be held responsible. The response to that from the other side of the people who are proponents of deploying autonomous weapons say there's always going to be someone responsible because there's a chain of command. And so ultimately, yeah, you could bring it all the way up to the government, whoever gave the signal to use these or the permit to use them. So it's not that no one's responsible, but there's not somebody who, as it were, pulled the trigger.
So let's get to final thoughts and takeaways. So, Dr. Navon, as we wrap up, what do you see as the most critical ethical consideration as AI continues to advance? How can we prepare to address them? What are the cases when we should be extremely aware of AI ethics and act out of understanding of it?
I think that, look, there's a lot of big issues and there's a lot of little issues. I mean, the biggest one that takes all the headlines is what's called the alignment problem. How are we going to make sure that the AIs that we are developing have the same values? They're aligned with our values. The classic example of this was put forth by a philosopher by the name of Nick Bostrom. He called it the paperclip problem. I have a paperclip factory and I want to make lots of paperclips. So I tell my machine, make me paperclips. And the machine goes out and converts all the resources of the world to making paper clips. He kills people. He takes out the metal of their teeth. He converts anything he can into paper clips. So you need to be able to say, oh, by the way, don't kill anybody. And oh, by the way, don't steal anything. And oh, by the way, all the values that we have when we put together a company. So the concern is that you'll always have a hole and you're not going to be able to get the machine to be 100% aligned. And then you run into what's called the control problem. So now what if it does go berserk? Can you pull the plug on it? And so there's concern that we may even lose control to that point and that we won't be able to stop it. So those are big, big concerns that many people are working on, thinking about. There's people who are very skeptical, like George Hinton and Yoshua Bengio. There's people who believe that we will develop the solutions, like Jan LeCun and Ilya Sutskever, who just quit OpenAI in order to open his own super alignment company, where that's all he's working on. He has a place in Silicon Valley and he has a place here in Tel Aviv, focused on that, on just that problem. But it is definitely a big problem. But I think there's more local problems, like, for example, deep fakes. Deep fakes, if you're not aware, basically, you can take any person and you can put their face on percent of all deep fakes on the web are porno, which are affecting not only famous women, but also girls in high school. It's a terrible thing. I mean, you're basically completely abusing the individuals that are involved. That's something that people are beginning to work on and legislate against, and we need to develop technology to bind it with ethics. I think that what's important is that we need to make people aware of the issues and the ethics involved and work together as engineers, as regulators, as users, to all understand what are the issues.
I fully understand that. I agree that alignment with values, and what kind of values, because the world is not homogeneous and different parts of the world have different, values. And I think it's also becoming a matter of politics as well. So yeah, I fully agree that it's going into that direction. And finally, the big question, but you can answer very briefly. In your view, what is AI ethics? What is it critical for? Why is it critical for everyone, not just experts, to grapple with these concepts?
So I think that Rav Kook put it best when he said that humanity will achieve its purpose through the development of science and technology. However, that is only if it's bounded by ethics, because he was aware, as we are aware, that technology holds great peril and great progress and purpose. And so we need to be able to put a framework around it. And I think that's one of the reasons that I'm teaching AI ethics to engineers at Ben Gurion. They brought me in specifically because they understand that the engineers who are going out and developing this technology also need to be aware. It's not that they're going to necessarily make specific decisions, but that they should be able to be aware of what is involved, because you may actually come into a place that you'll have to ask a question, and if not make the decision yourself, at least bring other people, be aware that there is a question here. And when I teach ethics, so in the beginning, so people, they say, oh, well, that's just the way it is, and this is what I think, and it's just my intuition. But really, ethical thinking is based on a lot more than that. You develop your intuitions and you develop how it is that you're going to approach problems by looking at other problems, by looking at the ways other people think. And so it's true that I bring to bear Jewish ethics, but that doesn't mean that I don't also look at secular ethics and the classic approaches of utilitarianism and Kant's deontology, and all of this thinking together helps us to be able to grapple with these modern dilemmas.
Fantastic. Dr. Navon, thank you for this unbelievable discussion. You have highlighted the complex interplay between fundamental wisdom and modern technology. Thank you for this.
My pleasure.
As we conclude, I'd like to emphasize to our viewers the importance of engaging with these ideas. The ethical frameworks we develop today will shape the future of AI and, by extension, our society. We encourage you to continue this conversation in your communities, workplaces, and educational institutions. For those interested in diving deeper, Dr. Navon's work and our association's resources are available on our website. Thank you all for joining us, and until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving for an ethical approach to AI. Thank you, everybody.